My daughter-in-law accused me of stealing family jewelry in front of my grandchildren, but that was only the beginning of a story she never expected me to tell. I can still feel the way the room froze that evening, the sting of her words cutting through me like a knife. "Where is my bracelet? You must have taken it," she hissed, her voice rising loud enough for everyone to hear. My grandchildren's innocent faces turned toward me, their eyes wide with shock and confusion, as if they were trying to decide whether their grandfather could truly be a thief. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. That was the moment my heart broke, not because of her accusation alone, but because of the way it instantly tainted the bond between me and the children I adored more than life itself. I had spent a lifetime building this family. Every brick in the house we stood in was laid with my sacrifice. Every opportunity my son ever had was paid for with my sweat. Every comfort his wife enjoyed came from the labor of my hand. Yet, in one careless, venomous accusation, she stripped me of my dignity in front of the very souls I lived for. The silence that followed was unbearable. My son looked down, unwilling to meet my gaze. He did not defend me. He did not speak. He let her words hang in the air like truth, and in that instant I realized how fragile my place in their lives had become. The grandchildren shuffled nervously, their small hands clutched together, as if they too were afraid of what might come next. I wanted to reach out to them, to tell them that I would never steal, that I had given away more in my life than most people would ever own, but my throat locked tight. My daughter-in-law smirked, triumphant in her accusation, and I stood there, trembling, humiliated, stripped bare of all the respect I had earned over the years. Do you know what it feels like to be painted as a criminal in your own home? To have the walls you built turn into witnesses against you? I can still hear the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears as she repeated her words, louder this time, making sure that everyone heard. It was not just about the missing jewelry. No, it was about power. She wanted to make me small, to push me aside, to make sure that the children saw me not as a figure of love and guidance, but as a man to be distrusted. And as I stood there, my hand trembling around the arm of the chair for support, I realized something I had ignored for too long. This was not the first insult, but it was the deepest cut. I had endured her sharp tongue before. I had looked away when she dismissed me, when she rolled her eyes at my advice, when she whispered to my son about how old-fashioned I was. But accusing me of theft before my grandchildren was more than disrespect. It was war. I did not answer her right away. I let the silence speak, because silence has power too. Inside, though, I was screaming, my mind racing back through every sacrifice, every hour of work, every coin I had handed over to keep this family afloat. Was this my reward? To be branded a thief by the woman who had taken so much from me already? My chest tightened, but alongside the pain came something else, something colder and stronger. Resolve. She thought her words had broken me. She thought my silence meant defeat. But what she did not know was that in that very moment, she had awakened something in me she could never control. She had written the first line of a story, but I would be the one to write the ending. The weight of betrayal settled on me heavier than anything I had ever carried before, heavier than the years of labor, heavier than the nights without sleep, heavier even than the debts I had once paid off to save my son from ruin, because this was not the burden of work or sacrifice. This was the burden of being branded as a criminal by the very family I had built my life around. And there are no words that can truly capture the way it carves into your soul when the faces you love most in this world look at you with suspicion instead of trust. When the home you poured every ounce of strength into suddenly feels like a courtroom, and you are standing trial with no defense. Your dignity dangling by a thread, your voice stolen by the crushing force of humiliation. I could not believe what I had heard. I could not believe that the woman I had welcomed into my family, the woman I had accepted and supported, could so brazenly throw such venom into the air with no thought for the consequences, and I could not believe that my son, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, the boy whose future I fought tooth and nail to secure, stood silent as stone, letting the accusation hang over me like a noose. My heart pounded with disbelief, but my silence was born not of guilt, but of pain, because in that instant I realized that everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, meant nothing in the eyes of the people I had given it all to, and the sting of that truth burned deeper than any insult ever could. I thought of the nights I had gone hungry so they could eat, the years I spent working double shifts to make sure my son had his chance at education, the gifts I had bought, the vacations I had quietly paid for, the jewelry I had once gifted my daughter-in-law herself, pieces that she wore proudly without ever acknowledging where they came from, and now she dared to call me a thief. She dared to plant the seed of doubt in the minds of my grandchildren, and I could already see the way their eyes had changed, the innocence clouded by confusion, as though they too wondered if their grandfather had done such a shameful thing. The humiliation coursed through me like poison, and yet beneath it a strange calm began to grow, because betrayal has a way of hardening you. It strips away illusions. It forces you to see the truth in its rawest form, and the truth was that I was nothing more than a burden in their eyes now, an obstacle between them and the life of ease they believed they deserved. To be treated as a criminal after giving my life to them was more than an insult. It was the shattering of a bond I thought unbreakable, and in that shattering I felt the first stirrings of something I had long buried: anger, cold and steady, anger that would not shout or thrash, but anger that would plan, anger that would wait, anger that would strike with precision when the time was right. They thought they had humiliated me into silence, but what they had really done was awaken the part of me they had always underestimated, the part of me that remembered every slight, every dismissal, every arrogant smirk, and that part of me, the part forged in sacrifice and endurance, would not let this betrayal go unanswered. I closed my eyes that night, and the memories flooded back uninvited, as if my mind was desperate to remind me of the long path that had brought me here, of the years I had poured into this family brick by brick and drop by drop of sweat, of the sacrifices that had shaped not only my son's life, but the lives of everyone who now turned their backs on me so easily, and I could see it all as clearly as if I were standing there once more, a young man with calloused hands, laying the foundation of the house that would one day shelter them all, working until my muscles ached and my lungs burned, never complaining, never faltering, because I believed that one day the walls I built would hold not just a family, but love, warmth, and respect. I remembered the endless nights when my son was still a boy, and I would come home from the factory covered in dust, only to sit at the kitchen table helping him with his schoolwork, refusing to let exhaustion rob me of the chance to guide him toward a better life, because I swore to myself that he would never know the same struggles I had faced. I remembered pawning my own wedding band once to cover his tuition, the hollow feeling of slipping it off my finger and watching it vanish into the pawnbroker's hand, but I told myself it was only a ring. Metal could be replaced. What mattered was that my boy's future remained intact. I remembered the vacations I never took, the hobbies I never pursued, the clothes I wore until they were threadbare, because every spare cent went into savings for his education, his first car, his wedding, and his home. I remembered building the very house where the accusations now echoed, hammering beams and laying floors with hands that blistered and bled, not because I wanted recognition, but because I wanted my family to have a place they could always return to, a place that would stand strong even when I was gone. And when my son met the woman who would become my daughter-in-law, I opened my arms wide. I treated her as my own daughter, showering her with gifts she never knew I could barely afford, buying her jewelry and dresses, footing the bills for their honeymoon, writing checks quietly when they fell behind on payments, never once asking for thanks, because family, I believed, should not need gratitude. Family should be built on love. I remembered the pride in my chest the day my son graduated, the tears that blurred my vision as I clapped for him, never letting him see how close I had come to breaking just to make sure he reached that stage. And I remembered the day he handed me the keys to his first home, his voice filled with joy as he said it was all thanks to me, though even then his wife had rolled her eyes and muttered that everyone had to work hard, as if my sacrifices were no different from anyone else's. These memories swirled like a storm inside me, sharp and relentless, and with every flash I felt the betrayal dig deeper, because all of those sacrifices, every sleepless night, every aching bone, every penny given without hesitation, all of it had led to this moment where I was accused of stealing jewelry in the very house my own blood and sweat had built. And the cruel irony of it all was that the woman who had made the accusation would never have owned such jewelry if it were not for me, the man she now sought to disgrace. Her voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and cold, dripping with arrogance as she repeated her accusation, her tone growing louder as though volume alone could transform her lie into truth. And I stood frozen, watching the woman my son had chosen as his wife stand before me with fire in her eyes and venom on her tongue, spitting out words that no elder in a family should ever have to hear. "Just admit it," she sneered, her arms folded across her chest, her chin lifted high in triumph. "The bracelet is gone, and you were the only one who could have taken it. You've always looked at my jewelry like it belonged to you." I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, the disbelief swirling into rage, but I did not let it show, not yet, because what held me in place was not just her cruelty, but the unbearable silence of my son, who stood at her side, his head lowered, his lips pressed tightly together, refusing to defend me, refusing to speak even a single word in my favor. That silence was louder than her voice. That silence was a betrayal all on its own, because while her arrogance could be explained by greed and malice, his silence was born from weakness, from cowardice, and it burned deeper than any insult she could hurl at me. I glanced at my grandchildren, their little faces pale and uncertain, their wide eyes darting between their mother and me, and in that moment I saw something shatter inside of them too. The pure trust they once had in their grandfather, now poisoned by doubt planted so recklessly by the woman who should have been teaching them respect. Their lips trembled as if they wanted to speak but did not dare, and I could see in their confusion the seeds of suspicion she had planted taking root, and the sight of it almost broke me. My hand tightened around the armrest of the chair, my knuckles white, because I knew if I let my anger spill out now, if I raised my voice, I would only prove her words in their young eyes. And so I bit down on the storm inside me, holding it back with every ounce of restraint I had left. She leaned closer, her smirk widening, her voice dripping with mock sympathy as she added, "It's such a shame, really, at your age resorting to stealing. How humiliating that must be. The arrogance of it made my chest tighten, my vision blur at the edges, and still my son said nothing, not even a whisper, as if my dignity were a small price to pay for the comfort of avoiding conflict with his wife. I searched his face for some sign of loyalty, some flicker of the boy who once clung to me in storms and called me his hero, but all I saw was a man shackled by fear and indifference, and in that absence, my resolve hardened. The children's eyes remained fixed on me, pleading silently for an answer, for some reassurance that their grandfather was not the villain their mother painted him to be. But words failed me, and the silence stretched unbearably long, a silence that became the cruelest confrontation of all, where her arrogance, his betrayal, and their innocence clashed and left me standing alone, my dignity bleeding out into the floorboards of the home I had built with my own hands. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the same living room where years ago I had watched my son take his first steps, where I had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and quiet evenings filled with laughter. But now the air felt heavy, and the walls seemed to echo with betrayal instead of warmth, as if every corner of the house was whispering reminders of what I had given and what had been taken from me. The house had always been more than wood, plaster, and stone to me. It had been a monument to sacrifice and perseverance, built nail by nail with hands that never stopped working, even when exhaustion threatened to break them. A place I imagined would always protect and embrace the family I had poured my life into. Yet in that moment it felt cold, foreign, and unforgiving, as though the house itself had turned against me. I ran my hand over the arm of the chair, tracing the familiar grooves in the wood, remembering how I had carved it myself one summer when money was tight and we could not afford new furniture, remembering the pride I felt not because it was perfect, but because it was ours, because it was made with love, and now I wondered how that love had decayed into suspicion and disdain. I looked around at the walls lined with photographs, snapshots of birthdays where the children grinned with frosting on their cheeks, graduations where my son wore a cap and gown, anniversaries where my late wife and I had stood hand in hand, smiling at a future we thought would be secure, and I felt the bitterness rise in me as I realized those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the accusation that had been hurled like a stone into the fragile glass of my dignity. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake patching leaks in the roof, the winters when I burned my own savings to keep the heat running so no one else would shiver, the countless hours I had devoted to keeping this house alive, and now it seemed as if every sacrifice I had made was mocking me because the very people I had sheltered within these walls had cast me aside like a stranger. The laughter I once heard here was gone, replaced in my mind by the sharp sound of her voice accusing me, the heavy silence of my son refusing to defend me, the uncertain whispers of my grandchildren wondering if their grandfather had truly become a thief, and in that silence the house itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of betrayal. I sat staring at the door, remembering the day I first unlocked it and carried my family across the threshold, certain that it would be the place where we would grow together, where generations would come and go, and where love would always outweigh conflict. But now I realized that love alone was never enough, because love without respect was fragile, and respect once shattered could never be rebuilt the same way again. The house held my memories, but in that moment those memories felt like chains, binding me to a life where my sacrifices had been wasted. And, though the betrayal stung, the coldness of those walls reminded me that nothing, not even the home I had built with my own hands, was safe from the poison of ingratitude. It was late in the evening when I heard it, the kind of moment that seems almost too cruel to be real, Yet there it was, drifting through the half-open door like smoke seeping into a room, a whisper that carried more venom than any shout ever could. And as I stood there in the hallway, hidden in the shadows, I realized my daughter-in-law was not just reckless with her accusations, but deliberate, calculating, and shamelessly confident in her schemes. Her voice was low but laced with smug satisfaction as she spoke on the phone, words that will never leave me. "It's going to be easier than I thought. He's weak. He doesn't fight back. Soon enough, he'll be out of this house, and everything will finally be ours." I froze, my stomach twisting into knots, because in that instant, the missing bracelet, the public humiliation, the cruel sneers, all made perfect sense. They were not random outbursts. They were pieces of a plan, a strategy to strip me of the very things I had spent my life building, to push me out of the house I had raised my son in, the house I had poured my strength and sacrifice into, so she could tighten her grip on the family assets as though she had earned them. I pressed my hand against the wall, steadying myself, the betrayal cutting deeper than ever before, because I could hear the laughter in her voice, the glee of someone who believed victory was already hers, who saw me not as a man, not as a father or grandfather, but as an obstacle to be removed. She continued speaking, her tone dripping with disdain. "He doesn't even realize how easy it's going to be. He's old, tired, and the kids already look at him differently after what I said. Soon they won't question it when he's gone." My breath caught in my throat, the pain of those words heavier than anything she had thrown at me before, because it was not just about stealing my dignity, it was about erasing me entirely, rewriting my place in this family as if I had never mattered at all. My son's faint murmur followed, his words indistinct, but his silence spoke volumes, because he did not argue, he did not push back, he let her continue unchallenged, and that silence was worse than betrayal, it was consent. My mind reeled, flashes of memory colliding with the present, images of me working late into the night, of me carrying my son on my shoulders, of me holding him close when storms rattled the windows, all now poisoned by the realization that the boy I had loved with every fiber of my being was allowing his wife to plot my downfall. I wanted to storm into the room, to demand answers, to shout the truth until the walls themselves trembled, but I held back, biting down on the fury rising in my chest, because I knew something then that I had not known before. She underestimated me. They both did. They saw only an old man too weary to fight, but what they did not see was the fire she had kindled with her cruelty, the resolve that was hardening inside me with every word she spoke. Her whisper of doubt was meant to break me, to convince me of my own weakness, but instead it revealed her arrogance, her mistake, because she had shown me her hand too soon, and now I knew that the fight ahead was not just about clearing my name, it was about reclaiming my rightful place and proving that I was not a man to be discarded. I had endured more than anyone could ever imagine, the small slights that piled up like stones until they formed a mountain pressing against my chest, the whispers about my age and usefulness, the mocking glances when I spoke of values that no longer seemed to matter in this house, the dismissive way she would brush past me, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience lingering in her space. And through it all I held my tongue, convincing myself that patience was strength, that silence was dignity, that eventually they would see the depth of what I had given and learn to respect it. But standing there branded as a thief before the innocent eyes of my grandchildren, I knew with a clarity sharper than any blade that patience had done nothing but feed their contempt, And silence had only written me into the role of a man too weak to defend himself. I thought back to every moment I had swallowed my pride for the sake of keeping peace, every time she had laughed at my simple clothes while wearing the gifts I had bought her, every time she rolled her eyes at my stories from a life she could never understand, every time she whispered to my son that I was old-fashioned, a burden, a relic best left ignored, and I realized that each insult was a brick in the wall she had built between me and my family, a wall that now stood complete with her public accusation as its crowning stone. The humiliation of that moment was like fire beneath my skin, not just because she had dared to call me a thief, but because my son had stood there mute, allowing the poison to spread unchecked, letting the children's hearts fill with doubt, and in that instant my patience snapped, shattering into 1,000 pieces. I understood then that kindness without boundaries becomes weakness, that sacrifice without recognition becomes invisible, that love given without limits invites only exploitation, and I swore silently to myself that I would not be humiliated again, not by her arrogance, not by his silence, not by the indifference that had crept into the very home I built. My chest heaved as I sat alone in the quiet, my mind replaying her words, my son's silence, my grandchildren's faces, and I felt a cold calm settle in me, the kind that comes not from peace but from decision, the unshakable resolve that there would be no more patience, no more turning the other cheek, no more waiting for gratitude that would never come. She believed she had won, that her words had pushed me into a corner where I would wither quietly, but what she had done was ignite the part of me that refuses to be broken, the part of me that has carried burdens heavier than her greed, the part of me that has fought battles she could never comprehend. And now that part had woken fully, sharp and relentless. I knew then that the time for endurance was over, the time for silence was gone, and what lay ahead would not be the meek acceptance of a man beaten down, but the careful, deliberate preparation of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. As I sat in the dim stillness of that house, the taste of humiliation still bitter on my tongue, I felt something shift deep within me. Not the hot, reckless fury that surges and fades, but a colder, steadier flame that burned with purpose, the spark of resolve I had long forgotten I possessed. For too long I had seen myself through their eyes, the quiet old man who endured silently, the one who could be dismissed, ignored, even humiliated without consequence. But in that silence I had underestimated myself. I had forgotten the intelligence and strength that had carried me through decades of hardship, through storms that would have broken lesser men, through sacrifices that demanded more than most could ever give. I had built a life from nothing, brick by brick, penny by penny, and I had done so not by chance, but by resilience, strategy, and endurance. And now I saw clearly that those same qualities would be my weapon, my shield, and my path to justice. The temptation to lash out burned in me, to confront her immediately, to tear apart the smug smile she wore as she plotted to erase me, but instinct told me that anger would only serve her, that shouting would only prove her point to the children, that rage would paint me exactly as she wanted them to see me. No, this would not be a battle of raised voices and slammed doors. This would be a battle of patience, of precision, of planning, and it was a battle I was more than capable of winning. I remembered the way she had laughed, certain of her victory, certain that I was too old, too tired, too blind to see through her schemes, and I almost smiled, because her arrogance was her weakness, and she had revealed her hand too early. She believed she was clever, but cleverness without caution is foolishness. And I had spent a lifetime outlasting, outworking, and outthinking men who underestimated me. Men stronger, younger, and far more dangerous than she could ever be. I told myself then that I would bide my time, that I would let her believe I was defeated, let her dig her own grave with her arrogance while I quietly prepared, gathering the tools and allies I would need to strip away her mask and expose her for what she truly was. Every humiliation I had endured before now, every insult, every smirk, every dismissive gesture, all of it suddenly became fuel for me, reminders of why I could not, why I would not allow her to win. I thought of my grandchildren and the doubt in their eyes, and I swore I would clear my name so completely that they would never again question the kind of man their grandfather was. I thought of my son, too blind or too weak to see the chains she had fastened around him, and I promised myself that when this was over, even he would see the truth laid bare. And as I sat there in that house, the same house that once held my sacrifices and now held my betrayal, I felt that spark of resolve grow into a steady flame, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would not rush, I would not stumble, I would not be careless. I would plan, and when the time came, I would strike, and when I did, there would be no recovery for her, no doubt for the children, and no silence from me ever again. Once the decision was made, my nights no longer belonged to restless grief, but to methodical preparation, and the same patience that once kept me silent became the patience that now sharpened my resolve into something unbreakable. I began with the documents I had tucked away for years, files I had almost forgotten about, deeds and wills and account statements that told the story of my life's labor in numbers and signatures. I spread them across my desk in the quiet hours when the house slept, running my fingers across the pages as if touching them reminded me of every sacrifice that made them possible. I examined the will I had drawn up years ago, one written in a time when trust still filled my heart, and I realized how dangerous my generosity had been, how I had handed power into the hands of people who now treated me as if I were disposable. I thought of her voice, dripping with arrogance, boasting about pushing me out, and I told myself that if she thought she could strip me of what was mine, she had no idea of the strength I could summon when cornered. With meticulous care, I reviewed every clause, every condition, every account number, making notes, circling vulnerabilities, considering what needed to be changed. But I knew I could not fight this war alone. Pride has its place, but wisdom knows when to call in reinforcements, and so I sought out professionals discreetly, men and women bound by duty, not sentiment, who understood the language of law and finance better than I ever could. I remember the first time I sat in the office of a lawyer whose reputation was built on precision and loyalty to the truth, and as I laid out my situation, I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the respect of someone who understood that I was not merely a victim, but a man preparing for justice. He listened, he asked questions, and when I showed him the will, the deeds, and the proof of what I had endured, he nodded slowly, as though the pieces of my plan were already coming together in his mind. Then came the banker, a man I had known for years but never leaned on heavily, and when I explained that I wanted to secure what was mine, to protect my assets from being siphoned away, he too understood, guiding me through the steps of tightening accounts, shifting ownership where necessary, and ensuring that every financial trail led back to me untouchable. These meetings became my quiet rebellion, my secret preparation, and every signature, every document amended, every safeguard put in place was a strike against her arrogance, though she had no idea it was happening. By day, I remained the same silent figure, enduring her dismissive glances, her false smiles, even the continued doubts in my grandchildren's eyes. But by night, I worked with determination, turning what she thought was weakness into the very strength that would unravel her schemes. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how reckless she had been, how deeply her greed had driven her into debt, how much she relied on the assumption that I would never resist, never fight back. She was building her empire on sand, and I was preparing the tide that would wash it all away. And as I placed the final stack of papers back into the drawer one night, my hand steady and my mind clear, I whispered to myself that patience was no longer silence, patience was strategy, and strategy would be the weapon that brought her to her knees. The first time I walked into his office, I carried not just a folder of papers, but the weight of betrayal pressing down on my shoulders, and I half expected him to dismiss me the way my own family had, to look at me with pity or doubt. But instead, he rose from behind his desk, extended his hand firmly, and greeted me with the kind of respect I had not felt in years. His name was Mr. Harrington, a lawyer known in town not for theatrics but for precision, a man whose reputation was built on seeing through lies and cutting straight to the heart of a matter. And as I sat across from him, the silence between us heavy with my unspoken pain, he leaned forward and said simply, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the jewelry, the public accusation, the silence of my son, the whispers I overheard of her plan to push me out and take what I had built, and though my voice trembled at first, his steady gaze encouraged me, and soon the words poured out like water from a broken dam. He did not interrupt. He did not brush off my fears as exaggerations. He listened, pen in hand, scribbling notes with quick precision, his brow furrowing only when I mentioned the will and the way my assets were currently arranged. When I finished, the silence hung for a moment, and I feared that even this professional might find my story too heavy, too dramatic, but instead he set his pen down, folded his hands, and said in a calm, measured tone, "You are not powerless. They may believe you are, but you are not. We will not let them strip you of what you have earned." Those words struck me harder than I expected, because for so long I had carried the weight of being underestimated, of being silenced, and to hear someone validate my struggle, to hear someone promise that I was not alone in this, it was like feeling the ground steady beneath my feet after weeks of walking on shifting sand. He began outlining possibilities, explaining how wills could be rewritten, how trusts could be secured, how the law could be not just a shield but a sword if wielded correctly. He pointed out the arrogance of her accusations, noting that public defamation was not just cruel but actionable, that her very attempt to paint me as a thief could become the rope she tied around her own neck. He spoke with clarity and confidence, weaving a plan before my eyes that felt less like revenge and more like justice. And for the first time since that humiliating moment in front of my grandchildren, I felt not just anger, but hope. As we went through the documents I had brought, he highlighted weaknesses and immediately proposed solutions, his tone never condescending, always practical, as though he saw in me not an old man grasping at straws, but a determined client preparing for battle. "We'll move quietly," he assured me, "because arrogance thrives on the assumption of ignorance. She believes you won't act, so we'll let her keep believing that while we set the stage." I left his office that day with a new steadiness in my step, The folder in my hands, no longer a collection of lifeless papers, but the blueprint of a strategy. And though the betrayal still stung, it no longer felt like a wound I would carry forever. It felt like the beginning of a reckoning. The deeper I dug, guided by Mr. Harrington's sharp advice and the discreet inquiries of a banker who owed me a quiet favor, the more the truth began to unravel before my eyes. And what I found was not just carelessness, but a web of deceit so tangled that even I was stunned by its reach. For years I had believed her arrogance was born of confidence, that her dismissive sneers and condescending tone came from some sense of superiority. But as the numbers lined up on paper, as the records whispered their truths, I saw her for what she really was: reckless, desperate, and drowning in the very greed that had driven her to humiliate me. Credit card statements revealed patterns of spending that defied reason. Designer handbags bought one after another, luxury trips taken with friends under the guise of family obligations, jewelry purchased on lines of credit and never paid off, and beneath it all, a mountain of hidden debt she had concealed not only from me but from my own son, who walked beside her, oblivious to the chains she had fastened around his future. I pored over the evidence with shaking hands, the bile rising in my throat as I realized that the very woman who had called me a thief was herself stealing quietly from her own household, siphoning away resources, lying with ease, manipulating not just me but the man who trusted her most. Mr. Harrington examined the documents with a grim expression, pointing out how she had opened accounts in her name alone, accounts linked to assets she had no rightful claim to, and accounts she likely believed would one day become hers once I was removed. The banker confirmed her debts were far deeper than she let on, stretching across multiple cards and loans, cleverly hidden beneath layers of false reporting. But numbers do not lie, and her empire of arrogance was built on nothing but sand. The cruelty of it struck me hardest when I realized she had even manipulated my son, spinning stories to him, justifying her spending as necessary to keep up appearances, framing her extravagance as sacrifices for their social standing, while in truth she was dragging him closer to ruin with every reckless purchase. It was not just money either. With every piece of information uncovered, it became clear that her schemes had always been about control, whispering doubts about me into my son's ear, belittling me in front of the grandchildren, weaving narratives that painted her as the savior of the family and me as a burden, a relic, a man best discarded. I remembered the smug tilt of her chin when she accused me of theft, and now I understood it better. She believed that if she destroyed my credibility, if she planted enough suspicion, no one would ever believe me capable of exposing her lies. But her arrogance was her downfall, because arrogance blinds the cunning, and she had left trails I now held in my hands, trails that told the true story of who she was. Each discovery tightened my resolve, turned my humiliation into ammunition, because now I knew that this was not just about clearing my name, it was about revealing her corruption, exposing her manipulation, and making sure that when the truth came to light, it would not just silence her accusations, but strip away the false power she had built. She thought she had trapped me, but in reality, she was caught in her own web, and I was now holding the threads. The cruelest cut of all was the irony, the bitter sting of realizing that the very woman who stood before my grandchildren and called me a thief had once accepted gift after gift from my hands, gifts that had cost me more than she could ever imagine, not just in money but in sacrifice. I remembered the first necklace I bought her, A delicate chain with a small pendant, nothing extravagant by her standards, but expensive enough that I had skipped buying myself a new winter coat that year. She had smiled sweetly then, thanked me in a voice so sugary it almost masked the calculation in her eyes, and I thought to myself that I had done right, that welcoming her with generosity would bind her to this family with love. How foolish that seems now. I remembered the diamond earrings I surprised her with on her first anniversary with my son, a pair she wore proudly to every gathering, tilting her head just so to catch the light, basking in the admiration of others. But never once did she mention where they came from. Never once did she acknowledge that it was I who had quietly parted with a small fortune to see her sparkle. I remembered the bracelet she begged for one Christmas, her voice soft, almost childlike, as she hinted at how much she adored it in the store window, and I went back the next day and bought it, watching her beam as she unwrapped it, a glow that made me believe my efforts had brought joy to the family, though she thanked my son more than she thanked me. I remembered covering their honeymoon expenses when my son admitted he was short, wiring the money without hesitation, and hearing her gush to friends later about how her husband had worked so hard to give her the perfect trip, as if my years of toil had not financed every sunset dinner she enjoyed on that beach. And perhaps the bitterest memory of all was the time I quietly paid off their late mortgage payment, slipping the receipt into my desk drawer so no one would know, because pride is a fragile thing, and I did not want my son to feel ashamed. She never found out about that sacrifice, but I saw how she strutted around the house afterward, acting as though she had cleverly managed their finances, boasting to neighbors about her stability, while I sat in silence, content just to know I had kept a roof over their heads. I remembered all of these moments like beads on a string, each gift, each sacrifice, each quiet rescue from the edge of ruin, and now those very gestures had been twisted into a narrative where I was no longer the giver but the thief, no longer the man who had placed treasures in her hands but the one accused of stealing them away. The irony was cruel, almost unbearable, because every glittering piece of jewelry she owned had a trace of me in it, a trace of my sacrifice, and yet she used those same pieces as weapons against me, turning generosity into ammunition. That night, as I replayed the flashbacks in my mind, I realized that her ingratitude was not just a flaw, but a disease, one that had grown unchecked because I had allowed it, because I had told myself family meant giving without expectation, when in truth, giving to the ungrateful only feeds their arrogance. And with that realization, my pain hardened further into resolve, for if she wanted to brand me a thief, I would show her the truth so thoroughly that she would never again be able to look at a single piece of jewelry without remembering the man who placed it in her hands and the man who would one day expose her for the fraud she was. The first moves I made were not loud, not dramatic, not the kind that would alert her sharpened suspicions, but quiet, deliberate steps that would shift the ground beneath her feet without her even realizing it, because if she thought I was an old man too beaten to act, then her arrogance would blind her to the changes I was putting into motion. I began with my estate planning, pulling out the will that had once been a symbol of trust and rewriting it into a fortress, no longer leaving openings for manipulation or loopholes she might exploit. With Mr. Harrington's guidance, we drew up a new document that safeguarded everything I had worked for, protecting my grandchildren's future directly, while cutting her entirely out of any possibility of gain. And as each page was signed and notarized, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, the first proof that I was no longer powerless. Next came the accounts, the savings and investments that had been left too exposed, under the naive belief that family would never betray me. The banker worked with quiet efficiency, moving funds, placing protections, and locking down access so tightly that not even my son, under her influence, could tamper with them without my consent. Every adjustment was another wall built between her greed and my life's work, every new safeguard a silent declaration that I would not be plundered. I transferred ownership of certain properties into trusts that she could not touch, securing the home itself under conditions that guaranteed it could never be sold or claimed without passing first through the hands of the grandchildren, a detail that gave me both comfort and grim satisfaction, because it meant that the very wall she wanted to control would one day belong to the children she tried to poison against me, not to her. These changes were invisible to her daily schemes, and that was the beauty of it, because while she smiled smugly across the dinner table, while she whispered her poison to my son, while she strutted through the house she believed would soon be hers, the foundations were shifting quietly, undermining her imagined victory. I said nothing. I revealed nothing, because silence was my shield now, and silence kept her blind. I remembered her laughter when she bragged about how easy it would be to push me out, and each time I signed another form, secured another account, rewrote another clause, I thought of that laughter and felt the cold satisfaction of knowing that with every stroke of my pen, her future was slipping further out of reach. It was not enough yet, I knew. This was only the beginning, but beginnings matter. And these first silent moves were the seeds of her downfall, seeds that would grow quietly in the dark until the day they broke through into the light and choked out every trace of her arrogance. I learned quickly that the most powerful weapon I had was not anger or confrontation, but silence. The kind of silence that cloaked my true intentions and let them believe I had been broken. At the dinner table I sat quietly, my head lowered as though shame weighed me down, nodding politely when spoken to, offering no challenge when my daughter-in-law's voice carried that smug undertone meant to remind everyone of my supposed humiliation. I saw the glint in her eyes each time she glanced at me, a glint of triumph, as though she believed her accusations had stripped me of dignity forever, and I let her think it. I let her bask in the illusion that she had won. My son, too, seemed to find comfort in my silence, interpreting it not as strategy but surrender, and though his eyes sometimes flickered with discomfort, he never spoke, never asked, never defended me, because silence made it easier for him to go on pretending nothing had changed. And my grandchildren, sweet and impressionable, looked at me differently now, a little warier, a little unsure, but when I smiled softly and spoke gently, they relaxed, and I knew that when the truth finally came to light, they would see it with their own eyes and know that I had never been the man their mother painted me to be. Inside, however, the silence was alive with planning. Every look I endured, every dismissive word, every false smile was another reminder of the storm I was preparing, a storm they could not see gathering behind the calm mask I wore. She thought me too old to resist, too tired to fight, too humiliated to rise again, and that arrogance was the shield that kept her blind to what was really happening. I made no complaints when she pushed me aside. I voiced no protest when she rearranged things in the house as though it already belonged to her. I did not even flinch when she spoke carelessly about new beginnings within earshot of me, because her confidence was my cover. All the while, my allies worked quietly behind the scenes, every document tightened, every account secured, every move calculated to ensure that when the storm came, it would be sudden, devastating, and undeniable. The hardest part was swallowing the bitterness each day, playing the role of the defeated man while fire burned inside me. But I told myself that patience was the price of victory, that calmness was not weakness, but power. The house I had built echoed with betrayal now, but I walked its halls with measured steps, knowing that soon those echoes would change, soon the walls would witness a reckoning, soon the woman who strutted so confidently through its rooms would realize that her imagined triumph had been nothing but a mirage. Outwardly I was subdued, inwardly I was unyielding, and though they mistook my silence for defeat, I knew the truth. It was only the calm before the storm, and when it broke, no one would mistake me for weak again. Behind the scenes, the storm was gathering, each day bringing me closer to the moment when everything would turn, and though I kept my outward mask of submission intact, inside I was a man preparing for war. The documents were no longer scattered fragments of my past, but a shield and a sword, rewritten wills that cut her out entirely, trusts that secured my grandchildren's inheritance, and legal safeguards that ensured every asset I had built with my blood and sacrifice was now untouchable. Mr. Harrington moved with quiet precision, filing changes, notarizing signatures, layering protection so intricately that even if she suspected, she could never unravel them. The banker mirrored this work, locking down accounts, transferring funds into places she could not reach, places where her reckless hands would never touch another cent of mine. Piece by piece, the empire she thought she was inheriting crumbled into dust before she ever realized the ground had shifted. But it was not just about protecting what was mine, it was about exposing her for what she truly was. Evidence piled up like kindling awaiting a spark. Records of her spending painted the picture of a woman consumed by greed. Receipts for luxuries bought on credit she could not pay, loans hidden from her own husband, jewelry purchased with money that was never hers to begin with. Mr. Harrington smiled grimly as we compiled it, his voice calm and steady when he said, "This is not just carelessness. This is deception. And when the truth comes out, it won't just clear your name, it will ruin hers." Hearing those words filled me with a quiet satisfaction, because every piece of paper, every damning figure, every signature tied her tighter into the web she had spun for herself. And still, I said nothing. Around her I played the role she wanted me to play, the tired old man shrinking in shame, too humiliated to fight back, too broken to resist. She grew bolder with every passing day, strutting through the house as though it already belonged to her, whispering poison to my son about how unreliable I had become, even telling the children that I should no longer be trusted with anything valuable. She thought her victory was inevitable, and that was precisely what I wanted her to believe, because arrogance makes people careless, and carelessness leaves trails. Each night when I sat in the quiet, the folder of evidence before me, I could feel the storm inside me growing stronger, not wild or chaotic, but focused, methodical, inevitable. I was not planning for revenge in the shadows of rage. I was preparing justice in the light of truth. Every safeguard was in place, every ally ready, every lie she had told carefully documented and waiting to be revealed. Soon the calm I had worn like armor would fall away. Soon the whispers and deceit would face the unyielding weight of proof. And when the storm finally broke, it would not be a passing rain, but a reckoning that swept away every shred of her arrogance. The day of the gathering arrived like the moment before a storm breaks, the house filled with chatter and the clinking of dishes, laughter that felt hollow to me because I knew what was coming, because I carried in my hands the weight of truth, bound in a folder thicker than any defense she could muster. I chose the moment carefully, waiting until everyone was seated, my son beside his wife, my grandchildren perched wide-eyed at the table, their innocence still stained by the lies she had planted. My heart pounded, not with fear but with a calm certainty, the kind of steadiness that comes when a man has nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. I rose slowly, their eyes turning toward me, and I could see the flicker of disdain in her gaze, that smirk playing at her lips as though she thought I might humiliate myself again. But my voice was steady, my tone calm, as I said, "Since I was accused publicly, it is only fair that the truth be revealed publicly as well." The room fell into silence, the kind that hums with unease, and I placed the folder on the table, opening it with deliberate care. One by one, I laid out the receipts, the bank statements, the records of her spending, each page a nail in the coffin of her lies. "This," I said evenly, pointing to the credit card bills, "is where the jewelry she accuses me of stealing came from. Not stolen, bought, recklessly, on credit she could never afford. Here are the receipts in her name, her signature, her purchases." Gasps rippled across the table, my grandchildren leaning forward, my son's face paling as his eyes scanned the damning proof. She shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering, her hand twitching as if she wanted to grab the papers and tear them apart, but I continued, laying out evidence after evidence, the hidden loans, the overdrafts, the accounts she had concealed. "Here," I said, my voice still calm, almost gentle, though inside I burned with vindication, "are the debts she has hidden from you, my son. Debts that could have destroyed your home, your future, if they had not been uncovered. And here is the record of the jewelry I gave her with my own hands, pieces she now uses as weapons against me, claiming theft when the truth is they were gifts she has long since forgotten." My son's eyes flicked toward her then, wide and bewildered, the silence between them louder than any argument, and my grandchildren stared at me with dawning realization, their confusion lifting as truth began to replace the lies. She tried to speak, her voice sharp and trembling. "This is nonsense, twisted numbers, he's trying to make me look bad." But the papers in front of her betrayed her, the receipts carrying her name, her signature, undeniable proof of her deceit. I looked directly at her then, my gaze steady, and I said quietly, "You tried to brand me a thief in front of the children, but today the truth brands you instead." The silence that followed was heavy, crushing, broken only by the sound of my son pushing back his chair, his face pale with shame and anger, not at me, but at the woman he had trusted. In that moment the power shifted completely, the calm I had carried for weeks bursting into the storm of revelation, and for the first time since the accusation, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders as the truth stood naked in the open, undeniable, undeniable, undeniable. The moment the last page slid across the table, the color drained from her face, the confident smirk she wore so often collapsing into something raw and panicked, her lips parting as though to speak but no words coming, because there was nothing left to defend, no lie strong enough to shield her from the mountain of proof staring back at her. Her eyes darted desperately around the room, searching for an ally, a shred of support, but all she met were the stunned faces of her own children, their wide eyes full of hurt and confusion, and the hardened expression of my son, who for the first time seemed to truly see the woman sitting beside him. He recoiled slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I saw it, the way his body shifted back from hers, the way his hand that once rested on the table near hers slowly pulled away, as if the very touch of her presence had become poison. She reached for him, whispering frantically, "It's not what it looks like. He's twisting everything. You know me. You know I'd never. But the words sounded hollow, stripped of conviction, unraveling in the silence that followed. My son's face was pale, his eyes scanning the documents with trembling fingers, each new detail striking him like a blow, every signature, every reckless purchase, every hidden debt betraying not just him, but the trust he had placed so blindly in her. His shoulders sagged as though a great weight had been thrown onto him, and when he finally lifted his gaze to hers, there was no love in his eyes, no defense on his lips, only the dawning realization that he had been deceived for years, manipulated by the very woman he thought was his partner. "How could you?" he whispered, his voice breaking in a way I had not heard since he was a boy. And those 3 words cut sharper than any condemnation I could have spoken. She shook her head wildly, her face pale, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the papers in front of her, as though destroying them could undo the truth. But the evidence was already etched into every eye in the room. My grandchildren clung to each other, confusion giving way to tears, their young hearts struggling to reconcile the mother they loved with the lies that now surrounded her. The silence was suffocating, heavy with the collapse of her carefully constructed facade, and in that silence I watched her arrogance disintegrate, her confidence crumble, leaving only the hollow shell of a woman stripped bare before the very family she had tried to control. She turned her eyes on me then, wide and desperate, but there was no venom in them now, only fear, only the recognition that the man she had underestimated, the man she had mocked and humiliated, had revealed her for what she truly was. I held her gaze, calm and steady, and in that moment the balance of power shifted completely. No longer was I the accused, the shamed, the silenced. She was, and nothing she said or did could change it. I looked at my grandchildren then, their small faces pale and bewildered, eyes darting between the crumpled figure of their mother and the steady calm I now wore like armor. And in that fragile silence, I knew what mattered most was not her humiliation, but their understanding, because it was their trust that had been wounded by her lies, and it was their trust I needed to mend. I rose slowly, my voice low and even, not sharp, not angry, but steady, the way a grandfather should sound when he speaks the truth. "My loves," I said softly, letting the words hang in the air until their eyes found mine, "I need you to hear this clearly. I never took anything from your mother, not now, not ever. In fact, for many years I gave jewelry, money, gifts, and all that I could spare to help your family live the life you have. I built this house so you would always have a safe place to come home to. I worked hard, not for myself, but for all of you." Their eyes widened, not in confusion but in recognition, as if pieces of memories they had tucked away suddenly made sense the times. They saw me slip bills quietly into their father's hand, the way new things always seemed to appear without explanation, the way I smiled and said nothing when they thanked their parents for gifts I had provided. I held their gaze firmly, not with bitterness, but with dignity. Sometimes people say things that are not true because they want to protect themselves. Sometimes they tell lies that hurt others. But I want you to remember this. Your grandfather would never steal from you, because everything I ever had, I gave to you freely. One of them, the eldest, whispered almost too softly to hear, "I knew you wouldn't." And those words filled me with a warmth I had thought lost forever. The others nodded slowly, their eyes softening, and in that moment I felt the weight of her accusation lifting from me, not because I had exposed her lies to the adults, but because I had restored my honor in the hearts of the children who mattered most. Their mother buried her face in her hands, trembling, but I did not look at her. I would not let her steal this moment from me. My son sat in silence, shattered by the truth, but even he seemed to realize what was unfolding before him, that the bond between grandfather and grandchildren was healing, that her attempt to poison it had failed. I knelt so I was level with their eyes, and I added gently, "No matter what anyone says, remember what you see with your own eyes. Remember the love that has always been here for you. That is the truth, and no one can take it away." And as their small hands reached toward me, hesitant but certain, I knew that I had reclaimed not just my dignity, but my rightful place in their hearts. The days that followed moved quickly, not because I forced them to, but because truth, once revealed, carries its own momentum, and the carefully constructed mask my daughter-in-law had worn for so long shattered beyond repair under the weight of undeniable proof. Mr. Harrington wasted no time filing the necessary papers, every document fortified with the evidence we had gathered, and soon enough she found herself summoned not to a dinner table where her arrogance could reign, but to an office where her debts and manipulations were laid out in black and white under the unforgiving eye of the law. The same mouth that had once accused me of theft now stammered excuses that fell flat, her claims unraveling against receipts in her own name, signatures in her own hand, bank statements that could not be denied. The humiliation she had tried to cast upon me returned to her tenfold, and this time there was no escape, no dismissal, no sly smirk to hide behind, because the law does not bend to arrogance. Financially, the blow was devastating for her. The accounts she had counted on were secured beyond her reach. The home she once strutted through as if it belonged to her was locked under trusts that guaranteed she could never claim it, and the creditors she had hidden from now came knocking, no longer shielded by deception. The image she so carefully maintained in public, a woman of status, of control, of elegance, crumbled quickly when neighbors and friends began to whisper, when word spread that her spending had caught up to her, that she had been exposed not as a victim, but as a fraud. Even her husband, my son, could no longer ignore the truth that lay before him. The shock on his face hardened into anger, not at me but at her, and for the first time he distanced himself, refusing to clean up her mess, refusing to shield her from the consequences she had earned with her lies. She had wanted to paint me as a thief, to rob me of my dignity, to steal from me the respect of my grandchildren, but in the end it was she who was stripped of everything that gave her power. Her debts mounted, her credibility was gone, her family's trust evaporated, and she was left with nothing but the hollow shell of the arrogance that had once made her so bold. The final irony was that she had underestimated me so completely that she had written her own downfall, and now she sat in the ruins of the life she tried to control, humiliated, powerless, and unable to undo the truth that had finally caught up to her. And as I watched the consequences unfold, I felt no need for gloating or cruelty, because the justice was complete in itself, the balance restored, and the false queen she had tried to be was dethroned by nothing more than the truth she could never escape. When the dust finally settled, and the storm I had carried within me passed, I found myself sitting once more in the quiet of the house I had built, the same walls that once echoed with betrayal now humming softly with something different, something steadier peace. The scars of what had happened would always remain. I knew that, because betrayal leaves a mark deeper than time can erase. But those scars no longer felt like open wounds. They felt like proof that I had endured, proof that I had risen, proof that I had reclaimed the dignity that had nearly been stolen from me. My daughter-in-law's downfall was not something I celebrated with cruelty, but the justice of it brought me a calm satisfaction, the knowledge that truth had triumphed over lies, that arrogance had been silenced by patience and resolve. My future was secure now, my estate protected, my assets untouchable, and most importantly, the bond with my grandchildren restored. Their eyes no longer carried doubt when they looked at me. They saw me for what I truly was, the grandfather who had always given, never taken, the man who stood quietly but firmly when it mattered most. Even my son, though broken by the weight of truth, began to look at me differently, with shame in his eyes for his silence, but also with respect slowly blooming again, respect that I thought had been lost forever. I sat often in the evenings by the window, watching the sun set over the land I had worked so hard to keep, and I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and strength. Sorrow, because the family I once imagined would always be whole had been fractured by greed and arrogance. But strength, because I knew now that I would never again be underestimated, never again silenced, never again humiliated by those who mistook kindness for weakness. I had learned that patience is not surrender, that silence is not defeat, and that even in the face of betrayal, there is power in waiting, in planning, in trusting the truth to one day stand tall. My peace came not from her collapse, but from my own restoration, from knowing that I had cleared my name, secured my legacy, and shown my grandchildren what true strength looks like, not loud, not cruel, but steady, unyielding, and just. The betrayal had nearly broken me, but in surviving it I discovered a deeper resolve than I ever thought possible. And so I lived with a lighter heart, no longer carrying the burden of humiliation, no longer haunted by whispers of doubt, but walking forward with the dignity I had always deserved, and with the unshakable knowledge that those who had once underestimated me would never make that mistake again. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.